When we left off, The Wire had just been greenlit for season 2 after a gut-wrenching first season that hardly anyone was watching. The highest viewed episode from season 1 had about 4 million viewers, while Homicide: Life on the Street, a show Simon was previously involved with that people also didn't watch, brought in at least 10 million viewers. Even for much of its last season, The Wire was being given another chance. What would Simon do with it? After season 2 was greenlit by HBO, Simon laid out the following structure for the entirety of the series. The first season, the dysfunction of the drug war, and the general continuing theme of self-sustaining post-modern institutions devouring the individuals they are supposed to serve or who serve them. In a way, this theme persists throughout the show. We see the bureaucracy, criminal justice system, and even the school system claim to cater to citizens while consistently setting them up for failure in order to reinforce the status quo. Second season, the death of work, and the destruction of the American working class in the post-industrial era, for which we added the port of Baltimore. This theme is still apparent in society. I'm waiting for the working class revolution to start as we speak. Third season, the political process and the possibility of reform, for which we added the City Hall component. Fourth season, equal opportunity, for which we added the public education system. When we get to season 4, we'll talk about how the boys of summer, the 4 boys at the heart of the season, all began in similar positions with similar circumstances and had equal opportunities only to turn out glaringly different. The 5th and final season will be about the media and our capacity to recognize and address our own realities, for which we will add the city's daily newspaper and television components. Simon was feeling a bit of pushback by the city, which was not surprising. No one likes a mirror held to their faces unless it's in their own hands. At the start of the second season, Baltimore's mayor at the time, Martin O'Malley, who held office for 8 years before serving 2 terms as governor of Maryland, running for president, and then was appointed Social Security Administration commissioner, asked them to film it somewhere else, likely because he didn't feel like the show gave a positive perspective of Baltimore. Simon offered to move to Philly to film, but reinforced that the show would still be about Baltimore. Here's how Simon described things. The mayor pretty clearly hates the show. Initially, after the first season aired, he held up our permits and told city agencies not to cooperate with us, and in a subsequent conversation with me on the phone, said that Baltimore wanted to be out of the Wire business. Upon hearing that the money would go to Philly, but the show would be about Baltimore, O'Malley completely switched up. I reminded him that before turning the pilot script into HBO, I had lunch with him and his chief of staff, and I told them that the next drama, should it be picked up, would be a much darker, much more realistic version of the city and its problems. I told him that I understood that Baltimore had already had 2 bites of the apple with Homicide and The Corner, and that if he wanted, I could certainly set and film the story in any number of other Rust Belt cities. No, he said, we're proud of the shows. Film it here. Similarly, after the first season aired, Baltimore City Council began an initiative to improve the city's image due to the impact of the television shows. I have a note here that says Simon ended up coming to a meeting or 2, which made them dislike him more, but I didn't write down where I got it from, so take that with a grain of salt. This season primarily focused on the port systems, labor unions, and how tech advancements prove how anti-worker capitalism is, with some information about property and land development sprinkled in. Of course, this season used real worker issues and anecdotes as its backbone. For example, one of Simon's writers, Rafael Alvarez's father, went on strike with the Seafarers International Union in 1966, after the gentrification of the recreation pier in the DMV area. Homicide was actually filmed there. They wanted to be considered more than casual labor, with a pay increase and guaranteed 40 hours a week. In part, this season was also a response to the closing of Bethlehem Steel in 2003. At Beth Steel, there were opportunities for employees with little formal education to get a decent paying job and to move up at the company. People were really shocked when Beth Steel closed and many jobs were lost. This is mirrored with the ports in the show. Simon would also say, it's about what happened in this country when we stopped making shit and building shit. What happened to all the people doing that? The show wasn't just about labor in general, it was about hard, skilled labor. Working in construction or auto repair or plumbing is generally looked down upon when skilled labor is literally where all the money is, and our society couldn't function without skilled laborers. And this season, Simon was looking to legitimize the struggle of these workers. Our new characters this season included Frank Sabaka, his son Ziggy, and his nephew Nick. Frank was based on a man named Walt Benowitz. His father and grandfather worked the ports and died in port accidents. Benowitz ended up working as a checker, the one that documents and tracks all the cargo that gets loaded and unloaded for the ports for a good while. Ziggy was partly based on a man named Pinky Bannon, who usually wore a suit to the docks and often brought his pet duck to the bar with him. He also had a problem with exposing himself, so just like Ziggy. Frank is an officer of the port union and accepted illegal work in order to raise money for their union to lobby for better working conditions. When a woman's body pops up in a large body of water and then a trailer full of women is found, an investigation begins. But this is only after the homicide and special crimes units tossed the initial body back and forth because neither wanted to investigate, and the city went back and forth between declaring the woman's death a suicide and a homicide. To the officers, this was just another murder that they needed to solve, and like we talked about in my video on the corner, to the people at the BPD, solving crimes is work, not fun, and definitely not altruism. Later in the season, the officers increased their presence on the streets to prevent homicides, but not because people are dying, just because they don't want to have higher homicide rates than the previous year. Still, the investigation in season 2 doesn't take off until Major Stan Valchek looks into the finances of the union because he sees their donated stained glass window displayed in their local church. Since the union consists of less than 100 men, Valchek didn't think they should have the money for the window and backed the investigation so that he could find out where the money for the church window came from, because that's what matters. This season, we also see white dealers for the first time. Like their POC counterparts, they start dealing drugs because there is both a big supply and demand. And getting more legitimate jobs in their area is difficult because of the persistence of the open-air drug market, symbiosis. The show's depiction of race, nationality, and heritage becomes more complex this season. Due to the mixed nature of the BPD in season 1, it didn't seem like the show was drawing any real conclusions about race in the first season. But in this season, the black and white characters do oppose each other to a certain extent. And then, when we get into the white characters, they are divided even further into Greeks, Italians, and Russians. The Greek isn't actually Greek though. If you know, you know. And as I said before, we start to see dealers who emerge as a consequence of their environment, much like black dealers. The white dealers are children of port workers, and understandably, they don't see a future at the ports where the men in their family have worked for years, and in some cases, generations. Cheese is also a new character this season, portrayed by Method Man, who had an opportunity to audition for the first season of The Wire, but he went to audition for the Sanaa Lathan and Taye Diggs film Brown Sugar instead, while his friend Hassan Johnson, who played Wee-bey, auditioned for The Wire. Method Man got the role in Brown Sugar, but he was cut out of the film. He got the opportunity to audition for season 2 of The Wire and said that he treated the audition process normally and showed up every day without an ego. According to David Simon, this is exactly what got Method Man the role. Apparently, Method Man also asked for Cheese's death scene in season 4 to change a bit. The original script called for Cheese to get shot, and that was it. But Meth requested that Cheese be able to talk his shit before he died. The death of D'Angelo was definitely the most touching event in season 2 for me. D'Angelo is sentenced to 20 years in prison because he took the credit for one of wee-bey's murders and spread the lie like a dummy. This juxtaposes the beginning of season 1, where he is acquitted of a crime that he did actually commit. Season 1 builds D'Angelo up as a fish out of water. D'Angelo is very smart and interested in things like chess and literature, but also feels the need to be a leader and to accept his role in the Barksdale organization. We're told from the beginning that this isn't the life for D'Angelo. In the first episode, when wee-bey is fussing out D'Angelo for talking in the car, D'Angelo is beneath the sign that says chicken. Contrastly, D'Angelo is out of place and uncomfortable when he and his girlfriend Donette go to a fancy restaurant. Even though we know that D'Angelo is smart and compassionate and hardworking and has money, he's out of place. D'Angelo doesn't feel like he belongs anywhere. Wallace, who had similar feelings, was the only person that D'Angelo felt he could relate to about this particular issue. D'Angelo saw Wallace's humanity, and that's why his death and the knowledge that his own people killed Wallace eats him up so bad. Here's a quote from Sadan Adlaka about D'Angelo's Where's Wallace scene. He knows Wallace is dead. What he seems to demand from Stringer is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that a life, a dynamic person with heart and promise like any of the terrorist's children, has been cruelly stuffed out. By the end of the season, even the cops and lawyers who pursue justice in Wallace's name turn him into just another bloody photograph on the wall as they build their case. Their game uses and discards people too. Wallace's death scene was bloody and heart-wrenching, but immediately after, we see a photo of it hanging on a corpse. He's just another victim. Even the people who killed Wallace, aka his friends Bodie and Poot, don't seem to treat him with any dignity after his death and don't acknowledge him as a person who lived and affected other lives, but Dangelo does. While in prison with Avon and Weebey, Dangelo asks to be left alone. He doesn't want to associate with literal child killers, even though Dangelo has killed before. He has to draw the line somewhere. A man has to have a code. When Stringer gets word that Dangelo is being distant, he puts a hit on him without telling the Kingpin and D'Angelo's big cousin Avon. D'Angelo is killed right after he gives a self-revealing analysis of The Great Gatsby, specifically the idea of being an imposter in one's own life. Many of The Wire's fans felt disconnected from this season and found it boring, likely because they felt they couldn't resonate with the storyline about the docks. However, I'd say that this season is more relevant in the cultural zeitgeist than ever before, with the incredibly high inflation, low wages, the way that second jobs and side hustles have become a necessity for many, rising debt and college tuition costs, and the way that technology has made many jobs obsolete. This season, we begin the journey of the character Dennis Cuddy Wise. He doesn't like the name Cuddy anymore, but he's not here to object, nor is he a real person, so we meet Cuddy in prison as he talks with Weebey and Avon. First, these three standing together represents how lopsided the justice system is. These three received varying sentences, with only a portion of those sentences being applied to crimes they actually committed. Cuddy also kind of juxtaposes the other two. Cuddy wants to get out of the game when he gets out of prison and returns to a very humble and difficult lifestyle, while the streets welcome Avon with open arms when he gets out, and Weebey is hailed as a hero for his sentence. Writer Stanley Corkin says that when Cuddy gets out, he inhabits the same space but not exactly the same time as these younger men. After he gets played by Fruit, Cuddy goes back to the lawn care crew where he works with a group of men who are illegal immigrants. He likes working in a more structured environment where his time is not his own, likely due to the structure that prison put into his daily life. Cuddy also juxtaposes Stringer. While Stringer works his fingers to the bone to get a land development project off of the ground in a more sought-after part of the city, Cuddy starts his boxing gym with a little seed money from Avon in the area of West Baltimore where they grew up. And all he had to do was ask. There was way less red tape in West Baltimore anyway. On one hand, this further humanizes Avon, who was a boxer in his teen years. He likes Cuddy, and he likes the fact that Cuddy turned away from the drug game, which is something that Avon will never be able to do, and that's why he gave Cuddy the money. Also, his helping Cuddy start a gym is similar to the other sizable donations of his that the show mentions in the first season. This is the reason that people like Avon. He is a man with a set of values and a dedication to his community. It isn't necessarily the same as Omar's code, but it ensures that he remains relatable. However, you can't help but notice the similarities between boxing and the drug trade. Not following the rules in terms of good form and sportsmanship can lead to a devastating loss. There's a tone of violence. You're in an enclosed space, and in both, you can be rewarded for your heart and bravery. In both, without the proper preparation, a loss can mean the loss of a life. Side note, Cuddy is a fitting name for this man. During season 4, after he gets his gym off of the ground, he starts piping down all the moms that stop by.
I ain't gonna lie, I got some Cuddy last night.
This season also brings about the idea of Hamsterdam, 3 areas where drugs are legalized in Baltimore by Major Howard Bunny Colvin. Rather than continuing to rehash old ideas, Colvin decided to try something new to address the city's addiction and crime crises. After the pit and towers were destroyed in season 2, drugs continued to spread throughout the city, the opposite of what developers wanted to happen. According to Simon, while gentrification creates a somewhat different demographic in some sectors, its benefits are not general. If anything, the raising of this public housing shows the city dispersing the building's former residents and redefining the spaces where they can dwell. It's like gerrymandering, but for the working class. When establishing Hamsterdam, Colvin instructed officers to ensure no one lived or worked in the designated areas so that they weren't in danger and got to take advantage of any benefits the rest of the city experienced due to the establishment of the drug zones. According to Baltimore native D. Watkins, the idea of Hamsterdam is brilliant and the city quickly sees crime go down. But in Baltimore, the stigma of drug use is more important than a strategy that works. Treating the addiction crisis as a criminal issue instead of a public health issue is one of the reasons many believe the war on drugs has failed multiple times over and led to the end of Hamsterdam. You may think it was Major Colvin's establishing drug zones in a city where he had no authority to do so was the issue, but as The Wire frequently shows us, rules are made up and often broken by those who wrote them. So Colvin overstepping his authority wasn't even the main problem. Even though it had become easier to buy, sell, and use drugs because of Hamsterdam, dealers were having a hard time making money because of all of the competition. According According to Corkins Connecting the Wire, the decline in work for people on the streets mirrors the efficiencies of market forces and technology that produce structural unemployment in the age of neoliberalism. Colvin's decrease in crime is a statistical trick, a matter of defining the drug zone as a discrete space where crime does not count and is not counted. Colvin was confident enough to go through with his drug zone plan because he was about to retire with his pension. However, once they find out what he did, he's demoted to lieutenant, his pension is taken, and he's fired. At the end of season 3, we get the death of Stringer Bell and the long-term imprisonment of Avon Barksdale. These two had a really great best friends to enemies story arc. In my opinion, Stringer is one of television's most vindictive villains and quite adept at throwing stones and hiding his big ass hands. According to writer Justine Elias, Stringer is a man both too smart and not crafty enough for his own good, a man who craved legitimacy but disdained rules, a man who does not truly know himself and who has run out of time to solve that particular puzzle. At the end of the episode Middle Ground, we get the scene of Avon and Stringer reminiscing about their friendship, even though they have both betrayed each other. Avon betrayed Stringer to Brother Muzone and Omar, while Stringer sold Avon out to the BPD. Elias emphasizes one specific detail mentioned in this scene. It is revealed that Stringer stole a badminton set when they were younger, even though he had no grass to set it up. This emphasizes that Stringer has always been drawn to the appearance of luxury and success and is willing to do anything to secure it. This aspect of his personality is essentially copied and pasted later on for Marlo Stanfield. You may notice that season 3 of the show buttons things up exceptionally well. A big villain dies. Avon, though he's more of an anti-hero than a real protagonist, is in jail. Omar was triumphant in his battle against Stringer and had an alliance with Brother Muzone. It wouldn't have been surprising if the show ended there, and that's because HBO was ready to pull the plug. According to Connecting the Wire, in 2005, HBO almost canceled the show because its modest viewing figure couldn't justify the $50 million it cost to make each season. The show was saved after Simon pitched the storyline for seasons 4 and 5 to Chris Albert. Albert was so taken with Simon's script ideas that he signed HBO up for 2 further seasons, even though they were unlikely to attract many new subscribers. I just realized that I didn't talk about Brother Muzone or his absolutely stellar beef to link up arc with Omar, and rather than scramble to write something last minute, I'm going to point you to this really great video that will do it better than I can. I'll leave you with a few lines from Simon's begging ass memo. The Wire is, I would argue, the next challenge to the network logic and the next challenge for HBO. It is grounded in the most basic network universe, the cop show, and yet, very shortly, it becomes clear to any viewer that something subversive is being done with that universal. Suddenly, the police bureaucracy is amoral, dysfunctional, and criminality in the form of the drug culture is just as suddenly a bureaucracy. Scene by scene, viewers find their carefully formed presumptions about cops and robbers undercut by alternative realities. Real police work endangers people who attempt it. Things that work in network cop shows fall flat in this alternative world. Police work is at times marginal or incompetent. Criminals are neither stupid nor cartoonish, and neither are they all sociopathic. And the idea, as yet unspoken on American TV, that no one in authority has any reason to care what happens in an American ghetto as long as it stays within the ghetto is brought into the open. Moreover, within a few hours of viewing, the national drug policy, and by extension our basic law enforcement model, is revealed as calcified, cynical, and unworkable. This is a smart series. It is good storytelling, and it could be the best work on television that I've done so far. Pull the trigger, guys. As with The Corner, you will only be proud. Season 4 brought in a lot of great new characters. Snoop, Chris, Marlo, and of course, the Boys of Summer. The Boys of Summer were instrumental characters in this season because they entirely encompassed the season's theme, street youth culture and the urban education system. The theme of the season originated from Ed Burns' time as an educator. In a 2008 New York Times interview, Burns said that 13 of the 220 kids in his initial cohort were shot. The Boys of Summer helped to further humanize the education crisis in urban areas. Melanie McFarland says, people take comfort in reducing other two statistics. Stats can be written off. Watching children live the outcome of malicious policy is harder to ignore. That's why what happens to these kids is seared into our consciousness. It never lets us forget how much protection they need and aren't receiving. Not only does using kids in the season humanize the struggles of urban youth, but they communicate to the audience just how easy it is to get stuck in the street life. Watkins says, for every good opportunity there is, to be educated properly and connect with some sort of role model outside of school who can help you realize your dreams, there are about 9 opportunities to do the wrong thing. Sure, public figures are known to make attempts at engaging students, but normally they visit only once a year with a camera crew if you're extremely lucky. Dope dealers and gang members are around every single day. The dope dealers normally have more than acceptable work conditions and are eager to show you the way. In season 4, Tyreeka Freeman from The Corner plays a small role and sums up urban school systems perfectly.
Not a goddamn thing up in here works like it should.
However, this is not to say that it's all the fault of schools. As we've discussed before, The Wire shows us time and time again how all these institutions overlap. According to Corkin, crime cannot be addressed because schools fail their job. Schools cannot be fixed because children live in a world of crime. And in a world of limited resources, those used to fight crime cannot be used to address the problems of school. If schools are underfunded, crime will increase, which means that we have to spend more money fighting crime and less on education. It's a vicious cycle. The Boys of Summer also show us how socially isolated the children in this area are from the rest of the world. According to Corkin, the neighborhood constitutes a form of social isolation, but the school is shot in a way that is so confining that the viewer may sigh with relief upon leaving its premises. We're trapped in the classrooms with the children as the teachers are turning the heat up in order to get them to be more complacent. Corkin also says that the problem of the ghetto is its social distance from other parts of the city. As a result, its knowledge is too specialized and untranslatable to be applied in many mainstream sectors. This is actually something that we saw in season 1 with D'Angelo and Donette when they went to a high-end restaurant and found themselves feeling awkward and out of place. Similarly, the isolation of the ghetto and those with low socioeconomic status make it easier to juke the stats and to overestimate the usefulness and impact of the tax-funded justice system. So long as the black, brown, and poor stay in their ghettos and kill each other, we're willing to pay for a police presence to keep them out of our America and to let them fight over scraps, which is what the drug war effectively is. In order to reinforce that the issues that The Wire discussed are still issues today, I wanted to very briefly bring up this recent scandal that's come out of Baltimore. I've been getting a lot of these news clips on my timeline, I think just because I've been tapped into a little bit of The Wire discourse on YouTube, and very recently there have been several reports of fake report cards being sent home and essentially of Baltimore County Public Schools juking the stats for certain students. So for example, there was a young boy who had yet to complete any of his service hours, but on his progress report it said that he had over 100 service hours because the service hours are required to graduate and he's a senior and he didn't have them. So instead of holding him back or reprimanding him and risking making their own stats look bad, they just gave him the hours he needed and then some. In addition, there's another report of a student who hadn't been going to school due to illness, and he got sort of fake comments and grades on his progress report because kids that are doing better in school looks good on a report versus kids that are not doing well in school. As someone who teaches, I don't teach in high school, I teach at the college level, but I'm still a teacher, and administrators absolutely look at how many of your students are passing or failing their class, in addition to other things. And at the college level it's a lot less stringent, but it absolutely does happen. You have to sort of come to a compromise between wanting your students to learn and care about their work and to do well, and reinforcing that by grading the work that you give and making sure that you are not holding students back just because they didn't do well on one written test. It's really difficult, especially because there are so many different ways to assess students based on their different learning levels and their different learning styles and what works best for them, and teachers have to make so many different adaptations and differentiations to their lesson plans or to their class plans or to their syllabi. It can be super difficult to teach students in a way that you feel is super beneficial to them, and even when you do everything that you feel like you should be doing, no you haven't because you actually suck. That's what all of the written pedagogical discourse will tell you. That's what all of the conferences will tell you. That's what all of your sort of check-ins with administrators will tell you. We're not doing enough. Somehow we're still not doing enough. Obviously it's a problem that will continue to grow and change, and so solutions have to continue to grow and change, but at this point I feel like we've been outpaced by the problems because we're not thinking of creative solutions any longer. Now let's meet the boys of summer. First is Namond, the only son of Weebey, and he has trouble working on the streets. He's worried about flashy clothes and appearing more masculine and threatening than he has the heart to be.
What happened to you? Ain't nothing. You need to see how the other nigga look. You fuck.
With a special class dedicated to problem students, Major Colvin gets to know Namond and adopts him toward the end of the season. This is monumental because he's the only one of the boys to make it out of their neighborhood, and his exit was blessed by his father wee-bey. Wee-bey, who put all of his stock in loyalty, recognized that the life he lived wasn't what he wanted for his son, nor was it a place where his son could truly thrive. Colvin's path away from the police force and into schools and then to helping Namond leads us to this conclusion. The idea that the only way a police officer can make a positive difference in a black kid's life is if they quit the force. Randy, primarily remembered for his smile, his good ideas, and his side business, is a foster child who unknowingly set up a tout to be killed by Snoop and Chris, Marlo's people. At the end of the season, after Marlo's people firebomb his foster mother's home, Randy is taken to a group home and immediately jumped for being a snitch. This is a consequence of the idiocy of the BPD, as Officer Hauk let it slip that Randy was the informant and did nothing to secure his safety. Randy really was doing his best in trying not to bring any trouble to his foster mother's house, only to have a police officer be the one to put his life in danger. The next time we see him is in season 5, and he's a much harsher person. Duquan, called Dookie because he stinks, is the only child in a family full of addicts. Addiction has plagued his family so bad that they don't have running water at home, and the adults in his life immediately steal anything valuable from him in order to flip it for a blast. Dookie is constantly teased at school and by his supposed friend Namond for his gentler nature, which is obscured as femininity, and his hygiene issues. At one point, the principal sends clothes home for him, but eventually, a new teacher named Presbalewski, or Prez, who was hustled into a teaching position after being fired from the BPD for his excessive use of force, specifically with black youth and an undercover black police officer, lets Dookie shower at the school. According to McFarland, Tillman becomes Duquan's refuge when the school year starts, or it should be, whenever that it proves to be true, as due to minor decisions such as a teacher sharing a sandwich or providing him access to a shower, enabling him to retain his dignity. This juxtaposes the fortress that other students see the school at. Both in this season and season 5, Prez forms close bonds with the boys, specifically Dookie and Randy, which is problematic in itself because of his history, leading to his removal from the force. Prez doesn't even have a teaching certification when he is hired because the school is in desperate need of teachers. Prez is simply not qualified to teach the kids and should get extra training before passing a screening of some sort to make sure that he's ready. On the other hand, Prez is one of the only people to really reach out in an attempt to help the kids. When Prez begins to understand all of the issues Randy is dealing with from the streets, he offers to adopt him. In addition to giving Dookie a place to shower, Prez essentially lets Dookie come to his classroom to use the computer whenever he wants. This includes staying late after school. His relationship with Dookie continues into the next season, but is unfortunately corrupted because of Dookie. Michael, played by Tristan Wiles, cousin of Jermaine Crawford, who plays Duquan, emerged as a fan favorite this season. His mother is an addict, and his stepfather, which is his brother Bug's biological father, is released from prison, and it's heavily implied that he used to molest Michael when he was young. This is why Michael has trouble building a relationship with Cuddy while he's in the gym, and assumes that Cuddy wanting to build a relationship with him makes him gay. Michael has a sort of pause about any male authority figure, even Prez. He recoils from them, listens with his head down, and doesn't speak unless he has to. Michael is a very righteous character, a lot like Omar. He has parental instinct and doesn't like when the bigger kids beat up on the smaller or otherwise weaker kids. Michael is taller than many of the others. He has hands, but he also isn't afraid of an ass whooping and uses that to his advantage. When Randy is about to get jumped outside of school for being a snitch, Michael stands 10 toes down and fights right next to him. He's the main person that goes after Namond when Namond makes fun of Duquan. When he finds out that a kid played Namond for his pack, Michael whoops Carvel's ass, even though Carvel's half his size, because he's loyal to Namond and he knows that Namond is chicken shit. When Namond picks on Duquan at Cuddy's gym, Michael literally slaps the taste out of Namond's mouth. Because of Michael's bond with Bug, he also allows a kid to get away when he helps Chris and Snoop kill a tout named Junebug and his family. Remember what I said about social isolation in the hood? When Michael needs help getting he and Bug away from his mother and Bug's father, he feels safer going to Marlo and not Cuddy, and definitely not any official authority figure, like a teacher or police officer. Why go to the police and risk being split up from your brother when you can go to Marlo, who will take care of Bug's dad and put some money in your pocket and give you your own place to stay? As each episode goes by, the viewer begins to feel more and more that a life on the street is something that Michael seems bred for. He kills Snoop without even flinching and outsmarts Marlo more than once. Even before he was fully in the streets, we see that Michael walks to the beat of his own drum. One of the first times we see Michael out on the strip in his clean clean white wife beater. Marlo pops up on the block to give out money to gain the favor of the younger boys so that his name will ring out in the streets. But Michael denies the money and does not back down, even with 2 adult men in his face. When a student named Letitia slashes another student's face, Michael is the only one in the room that doesn't react. This moment also tells us that these students are used to violence. I would have done 20 other things before taking a knife to that girl's face, and you probably would have as well. Though Randy and Namond both appear in season 5 for a little bit, the show actually continues to follow Michael and Dookie on their journey in the next season. Felicia Snoop Pearson had a difficult life prior to The Wire in her short time in reality television. Growing up, she had a mentor that nicknamed her after Snoopy, the dog for the Peanuts. Snoop's mother was an addict, and Snoop was actually raised by foster parents for a good chunk of her life, not unlike Namond and Randy. At first, Snoop was very well behaved while living with her foster parents, but the streets were all she knew, so it was only a matter of time before she returned to them. Snoop walked into a street fight and nearly got hit with a bat, and she shot the girl in retaliation. Snoop was 14, and it was 1995. She was convicted of second-degree murder and gun possession in December of 1996, and she was released in July of 2000. When she was locked up, Snoop was actually in the same prison as her mother, but she didn't know what her mother looked like. The last time she saw her, Snoop was a child, and her mother stole her clothing. After she was released from jail, Snoop attempted to work a handful of legitimate jobs, only to be fired due to her record. One night at Club 1 in Baltimore, Snoop met Michael K. Williams, who brought her down to the set. She actually had never heard of The Wire prior to being on it. About Michael K. Williams, Snoop would say, "Man, he was my angel. He said that I saved his life, and I'd say that he saved mine." I believe Snoop was the only actor allowed to ad-lib her lines, which makes sense because the scripts for the show were so intricate. Snoop was allowed to pull from her own real-life experiences. Her character would end up becoming a representation of Snoop's real-life reflection on street life. When I was growing up, we had rules. No kids, no old people, no women, things like that. Now today, it's like these kids, they don't have no rules. According to The Wire and philosophy, Snoop, the character, sees a world through eyes tinted in blood, where a nail gun isn't just a nail gun. Yet, by owning that violence, Snoop controls her life and can put down any opposition she faces. Though she took a role in the show, it's worth mentioning that Snoop discussed how she thought the show gave people a bad perception of the city. As soon as Marlo begins appearing in the show, we know that he's someone we should be afraid of. According to Alvarez and Simon, Marlo is very de-human. That's different from subhuman, which suggests an evolutionary disconnect or an insult in regard to intelligence. Marlo is exceptionally intelligent, and in an evolutionary sense, he's Machiavelli's ideal. He's been dehumanized to the point where he's incapable of understanding why he should care about anyone or anything that doesn't enrich his bottom line. It's hard to expect mercy from someone you can't imagine telling a joke or having a mother. Similarly, David Simon says, he represented the ultimate totalitarian impulse, beyond money, beyond power, or the exercise of power for its own sake, but instead, that strange combination of self-love and self-loathing that rarely dares speak its name openly. Marlo wanted money and power, not for their own sake, but so the world would know they were his and his alone. He defined for the purposes of The Wire the emotional end game for any and every power pyramid depicted. This apparently completely juxtaposes the actor that portrays Marlo, Jamie Hector, who is said to be a really polite and nice person. Hector was a part of Steve Mann's thesis film during Mann's time at NYU. While watching the penultimate episode of season 1 of The Wire, Hector's manager decided to get him on the show and sent David Simon and Friends Mann's short film. Hector was originally considered for Cuddy, but he was too young for that role. Then they considered him for Marlo, but they didn't have anything written yet in terms of Marlo's lines, so Hector had to read Avon's lines as Marlo, which I would love to hear. While watching the series, I never called Marlo by his name. I always called him Dead Fish Eyes. The disinterest with which Marlo treats everything in his life is probably the most apparent part of his character. He doesn't care about people, he doesn't care about death, he doesn't care about money or drugs or family. Marlo cares about power and control, and that's it. Throughout the show, Marlo doesn't speak much. He doesn't have to. Status, not wealth, is important to Marlo. If Marlo never made another dollar, but he remained infamous, he'd likely be perfectly happy with that. It also means that the things Marlo does take the time to say are that much more impactful. Marlo's entrance also shows us that the police are incredibly far away from the streets that they're supposed to protect. We see this through the way that everyone in the neighborhood knows about the bodies in the vacant houses this season, and who killed Lennox near the start of the season, while the police spend most of the season trying to figure it out. They were expecting people to say the quiet part out loud and risk getting killed by the same unfeeling man that had caused so much chaos in Baltimore in such a short period of time. Also, the price of the pack going up. Omar versus Marlo. Does that sound like a boxing match? Because it should. The idea that Omar and Marlo are foils is one that I got from writer Joanna Crosby, but it is likely a conclusion that I would have come to on my own. Crosby points out that Marlo is an anagram of Omar L, but we can take this a bit further by examining the actors chosen for both of these roles. Michael K. Williams was known for the scar on his face and using people's assumptions about him based on his appearance to further humanize his roles. However, not many people acknowledge that Jamie Hector has a pretty noticeable scar on his face as well that I doubt prevents him from securing roles or otherwise determines what kind of roles he and casting directors feel that he can pursue. Prior to associating them as foils, this connected them in my mind. Omar has a code and doesn't deviate from it, while as far as Marlo is concerned, absolutely anything goes. Marlo and Omar are both much smarter than a lot of the others in the streets. They're so smart that it isn't difficult to envision Omar and Marlo as lawyers or stockbrokers or legitimate businessmen. This is also true of Stringer Bell and Avon Barksdale, who opposed each other in similar ways. All four of these men had great leadership qualities, intelligence, and a great work ethic. But again, what does that mean when you have to pass 20 dealers offering you work on the street just to get to the nearest community college or internship opportunity? While Marlo is characterized as a ruthless leader due to his unfailing and unflinching propensity for violence and his desire for infamy, Omar is just the opposite. He doesn't like the way that some kids look up to him. We also get to know Omar through many of his intimate relationships, all of them incredibly short-lived but extremely impactful. He holds a baby while the mother, an addict, gets her fix. He forges romantic relationships with a few male acquaintances, all of which he seems to genuinely love out loud, even though the Barksdale organization and Marlo use his sexuality as another reason to kill him. Omar also didn't kill taxpayers or children, which is why his death at the hands of 12-year-old Carver in season 5 is so poetic. Writer George Pelecanos would say that Omar's death was important because Omar was a big deal in his world, but in the larger white world of Baltimore, he's disposable. Omar really was a beacon of hope in the show, snubbed out by senseless, almost random violence after Omar had beaten death several times and hobbled around on a broken foot from a 4th-story window jump. I actually read about Omar's death before I even watched the show, and I dreaded it the entire time. But while reading before the show, I also found out that when Michael K. Williams found out Omar was getting killed, he cried. This season primarily focuses on online and traditional media and is commonly referred to as The Wire's worst season, with season 2 being a close second. Overall, the season didn't seem as tight as the others, and the storyline about the institution of the media wasn't as compelling as the previous season's education storyline, nor did it blend in with the street culture side of the show as seamlessly. As we discussed in part 1 of this series, David Simon began in journalism as a high school student and ended up working for the Baltimore Sun for several years. He would say that this season was not the work of people angry at the Sun or trying to get even with this institution or that editor. It was written by ex-journalists who love the craft and who fear for its future. Simon was commenting on how the need for money and accolades had robbed journalism of its altruistic purposes. He was also alluding to the fact that he'd hired some of his previous co-workers from the Sun as screenwriters this time around. According to Alvarez and Simon, profit-taking through cutbacks and inability to confront and compete, use of internet, stunted coverage, small-time editorial ambitions, and a useless, self-absorbed prize culture. That is what remains of the good gray lady of journalism. The show establishes that despite the newspaper's close proximity to where many addicts and home insecure people sleep and live, they are laughably disconnected from the city that they are writing about. None of the journalists have street connections, and they are mostly white, so they have trouble getting tips and reliable information from people in the mostly black city. The show's depiction of the staff is likely accurate, as in 2018, only 11% of the newspaper's reporting staff was black, even though Baltimore was around 65% black. In the show, the amount of staff the Sun had also begun to dwindle. According to Corkin, the season tells a tale of a newspaper staff too small to cover a civic life in a way that sufficiently informs citizens and keeps city leaders, especially politicians, feeling accountable. A new character this season named Scott Templeton fabricates stories about a serial killer that goes after homeless people to move up in the newspaper. This is very similar to the actions of Jimmy McNulty. In an attempt to get Marlo off the streets, McNulty fabricates a series of homeless person murders and connects them all together by forging evidence. According to writer Steve Chambers, Templeton's character was largely based on 2 real reporters, Jason Blair and a nameless Baltimore Sun writer who fabricated stories like this for accolades. In the show, Scott Templeton begins by inserting small lies into his stories until they snowball into larger lies, and in the end, his job is protected because his stories were popular and he won a Pulitzer. According to Corkin, indeed we are in an era where truth becomes anything you can make people believe. And as someone who makes content on this website when I feel like it, It's absolutely true. I'm actually working on a video about this right now. Please stay tuned. I'm also slowly chipping away at a few videos about the Boondocks, the comics and the show. And I actually saw a series of strips commenting on the whole Jason Blair thing that I'll put on the screen for you here. I think it was about a week's worth. I believe when this season of The Wire came out, I was like 9 years old or something. Seeing what people had to say at the time about the Jason Blair thing is really interesting. After the show went off the air, The Sun saw even more budget cuts and layoffs. According to Watkins, while The Wire was filming, the Baltimore Sun had over 300 people working in the newsroom. That number is now under 70. Respectable newspapers have turned into outfits that will publish anything to survive, hungry to come up with content in the sea of online publications that seem to have popped up overnight. And according to Alvarez and Simon, in 2009, 60 editorial employees at The Sun were laid off in one day. In terms of the side of law enforcement, things are mostly the same at the end of the season. Watkins summed it up best, and just like in real life, a few cops were promoted from patrol to sergeants and lieutenants, a few street guys were promoted from corner boys to bosses, new addicts were birthed, and the game continues. And this season, there were some stringent budgeting issues that led to the police officers being paid in scripts, which were basically credits that they could redeem for cash later. How much later? Who knows? Mayor Carcetti managed to raise nearly $100,000 in a single morning for his campaign, but he couldn't possibly find the funds needed to make improvements in schools and law enforcement. I didn't talk about Carcetti much, I thought he was boring, but his storyline was primarily about politics and city bureaucracy, and how even those with good intentions can be corrupted by money and power. When BPD reaches out to the FBI for help in taking down Marlo Stanfield, they only agree if the state's attorney will prosecute Senator Clay Davis. I don't think I have to say this, but justice should not be dependent upon quid pro quo. Though Marlo avoids jail time for his drug organization and all the murders he authorized, despite the BPD having the FBI's help, he was essentially prohibited from getting involved in the game that he loves so much. If he's arrested again for a crime, he's going away for a long time. Writer Eric Diggins says, barred from ever getting back in the game, Stanfield is now sitting on a pile of money with no desire to operate in legal society, and no clue how. For him, a fate worse than death. Marlo is incredibly cold, and only because he's insecure. He doesn't know what meaning his life has if he can't control every fucking thing in it. This quote sums up Marlo's character perfectly. Although Marlo is a cold and calculating businessman who doggedly pursues his own monopolistic goals, he is also exceedingly thin-skinned and wedded to violence as an adjunct to his enterprise. He brings to his work the calculation of Stringer Bell and the love of violence that we associate with Avon Barksdale. At the end of the final episode, Marlo walks out onto the streets and immediately punches someone in the damn face, implying that he will make a way to be involved in the streets, giving no regard to what his punishment may be. Michael is donned the new Omar at the end of the season and sticks up drug dealers after sending Bug to live with their aunt due to the danger of his new lifestyle. No, I wish with all my heart to fly with dragons in a land apart. But I also wish that Michael and Omar would have gotten to meet during the show under better circumstances. The only time in the show that they meet, I believe, is this scene when Omar sneaks up on these guys in the corner and essentially tells them to tell Marlo that it's up. And you can tell that Michael feels a little intimidated by Omar, and likely not just because of Omar's reputation or because of Marlo's feud with Omar, but because of the way that Omar kind of sneaks up on Michael and how that relates to what happened previously with Bug's father. You can see that Michael exhibits some of the same sort of behaviors, and then, as we talked about previously, he sort of misconstrues men taking advantage of young boys with homosexuality, and Omar is gay, and we know that that has been spread far and wide throughout Baltimore. So Michael likely knows, and it just looks like he was more physically intimidated by Omar, especially because Michael isn't one to be physically intimidated, right? When he gets walked up on by adults or groups of people, he stands up for himself and for others. So the fact that he cowers so much when Omar is around really, to me, seems like it's linked to his interactions with Bug's father, and not just the fact that Omar come in and people are scared of Omar. Michael ends up dropping Duquan off in an area overrun with addicts because Duquan has become one of them and feels comfortable there. This season, Duquan was left wandering without a purpose since he decided to drop out of school with Michael. He actually tricks Prez into giving him a couple $100, and we have to watch Prez realize how little of an impact he's having in the lives of the children he teaches. Bubbles ends up getting clean and finally re-earns the trust of his sister, which is an ending he absolutely deserves. Arguably, Bubbles and Namond are the only characters that end the show with a sort of happy ending. You could count Michael as well, if you want. Wow, I'm actually realizing now that I forgot to tell you about Bubbles and his triumph over addiction, so here's what happened in a nutshell. In season 4, Bubbles took a kid named Sherrod under his wing. Sherrod was living on the streets, and he was an addict. Bubbles helped Sherrod with capers for a bit until he noticed that Sherrod could barely add and subtract. That's not good for business. So Bubbles posed as Sherrod's uncle and enrolled him in school at Tillman Middle, which is the same school that the Boys of Summer attended. Sherrod made an effort, but he had already fallen so far behind and he was already elbow deep in addiction, so he just couldn't do well in school. Bubbles begins encountering an addict named the Fiend, who robs Bubbles whenever he sees him. Bubbles' solution is to disguise a bit of battery acid as cocaine in his pocket so that when the Fiend robs him, he'll snort it and die. But Bubbles doesn't run into the Fiend. He goes home and falls asleep, only to wake up and see that Sherrod took the acid and died, just a few feet from where Bubbles slept. This sends Bubbles into a crisis. Bubbles is very charismatic, smart, and caring throughout the entire series, so it's understandable that he goes to the BPD and immediately reports himself for murder. When it seems like they're not going to arrest him, he attempts to hang himself. In season 5, Bubbles is clean. His eventual sobriety was foreshadowed in season 1 when Bubbles went to a meeting with a friend named Johnny and claimed his 24-hour sobriety coin, even though neither he nor Johnny was sober. In season 5, Bubbles is clean and stays in his sister's basement. He sells newspapers on the side of the road, he works at a homeless shelter, and one of the Sun reporters eventually writes an article about him and his journey. I'm literally about to cry. I love Bubbles so much. And his journey just really spoke to me throughout the show. Even though this season is considered a letdown by a lot of fans, I think learning about these crucial steps on the journeys of Michael and Bubbles are enough for me. Though the show is lauded as one of the best shows in the history of television, it only ever got average to low ratings. David Simon attributed low ratings to the complexity of the plot, a poor time slot, heavy use of esoteric slang, particularly among the gangster characters, and a predominantly black cast. Despite its ratings, time would prove to be a best friend of the show, and it would be taught at Brown, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, University of Texas at San Antonio, Paris West University, and Phillips Academy throughout the years. I am currently a teacher, and I also teach my students using this show. But I won't tell you where, because y'all crazy. Despite its large cult fan base, The Wire has detractors that take issue with its depiction of its black characters, and of the city of Baltimore in general. There's the aforementioned black history of Baltimore that the show doesn't bring to light. The Wire glosses over the Baltimore Afro-American, founded in 1892, and one of the country's oldest black papers, and the Baltimore Times, which covers non-crime related stories. Writer Erica Blount-Denbois also says that The Wire is missing some of the real Baltimore's mundaneness, and never shows that drugs are an impact in white neighborhoods, which we know is not true due to the season 2 arc about white dealers. However, writer Scott Wilson says, The Wire offered and still offers an incredibly nuanced and complex portrayal of how Baltimore's various institutions were affected and brought together by its heroin trade. According to Denbois, you get the sense that the writers have a fascination for black characters, particularly the ones in the hood, but not a love for them. And The Wire in philosophy supports this by stating the unfeeling way that characters kill and are killed in The Wire further pushes a racialized view of violence. This also supports the idea that The Wire isn't mundane enough and zeroes in too close on the violence of the city. Still, there is reason to love The Wire's dedication to realism. Realism needs something more. It needs the kind of unflinching, unapologetic portrayal of events you can't watch without feeling you've been indicted by or complicit with it. Though there are valid criticisms on the show, no one can say that the show wasn't honest, or that it didn't depict real occurrences, struggles, and corruption likely to be found in metropolitan cities across the United States. No one can say that this cast of characters didn't steal the hearts of many viewers with their dedication to one another, or that the cyclical nature of lives of those affected by addiction doesn't mirror the mundaneness of the lives of those of us otherwise trapped in capitalist systems. The humanness actors brought to characters facing addiction or neck deep in criminal lifestyles, or just trying to survive in the entropy of their their neighborhood encourages audiences to be empathetic when considering changes to our current criminal justice system, the war on drugs, education reform, and several other areas of public policy. As on point as The Wire's socio-political commentary is, I do hate that a show that was so unflinching about America's issues was stuck behind a paywall, and still is right now. I think America is flawed in that citizens often look to art to make statements and start discussions about public issues when we're supposed to have a government in place that we approach about issues with public policy. Since The Wire went off the air, many of the shows that come after it have focused more on crime organizations themselves. Shows like Snowfall, Godfather of Harlem, Power, For Life work to communicate the circumstances and mindsets of criminals, and at this point, I'm willing to bet that there are just as many crime dramas about criminals as there are straightforward police procedurals that are explicitly on the side of law enforcement. After The Wire, Simon worked on his shows Treen and The Deuce, as well as 4 miniseries around 6 episodes in length each, like The Corner. Apparently his next project takes place during the Spanish Civil War, but there's not much information on it outside of that. I don't really know how to end this video. The commentary of the show seems so timeless, it kind of doesn't even feel appropriate to try to button things up at the end of this video. The legacy of The Wire is more than entertainment and television, especially considering the way that the show was nearly throttled by real-life political figures and panned by critics in an attempt to silence its message. Perhaps I should end by talking about the resilience of the show's cast and crew, or the way that the people of Baltimore embraced them, or the emphasis that the show put on the humanity at the center of crime and institutions that benefit from it. Or I can say the price of the pack is going up. Bye.